Welcome to the Troubadour podcast. Today we are doing episode 1 of Metaphysical Monday. Now, as you may know, if you subscribe to the podcast, on Spotify or Stitcher or iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, except SoundCloud, I think, that we do now Sunday morning poetry. I'm also doing Ballad Wednesdays. I have some short stories coming out again, so we're going to be doing some Edgar Allan Poe. And then I thought I would throw in Metaphysical Monday. Now, why Metaphysical Monday? Well, first, although this podcast is fundamentally, and the whole magazine is fundamentally dedicated to romanticism, but one way to really parse out and understand something is to bring out the broader context. So, for instance, for us to really understand the romanticism starting in 1798 and really in the 1800s where it flourished, and if we assume that it maybe died around World War I, if we take that era of romanticism and we're focusing on the literature, particularly the poetry of, guys like Wordsworth and Keats and Coleridge and Byron and Shelley, if we take those and, other works as well, if we take the short stories of Hawthorne and the novels of Hawthorne and Victor Hugo and et cetera, if we take those as romanticism, there's also a question of what is romanticism? Like what is it really as a historical moment? What is it, the essential character of that era and that school of thought? And one way to really help identify this is to contrast. Now, I'm not going to contrast with the trash of today, but I am going to contrast with modern poems, with, there are some good modern poems. There are a few that I've heard that today, I read one not too long ago by Simon Armitage, who's the current poet laureate of London, of Britain, I should say, which was not bad. And, it's very hard for me to judge a contemporary work personally at this point in my career. I think it's very difficult. But anyway, it's not as difficult with the past because you can rely that if it's been, published and studied for 100 years, it's probably at least moderately good. So, but there are things like the what came before the Romanticists. What were the Romanticists, rebelling against or changing in their own way, and how can that help us? Now, this isn't a podcast that I want to be purely some kind of academic exercise. I do want us, and I think it's definitely possible to get a lot of value out of the poems that we read, whether or not it's romanticism. So I think it's false to believe that the only valuable, poetry is just the great romantics of the 19th century or the classics of of Shakespeare. There are great, even what may have germs of romanticism in there. And I think there is something just purely romantic about writing a high elevated poem in general of any era. So that's, kind of the mission that we're going after with Troubadour Podcast. And we're going to have some other things that the Troubadour magazine and troubadourmag.com under its umbrella, I hope that we'll have. And the goal is to kind of germinate and to cultivate a better form of storytelling, of the use of language and arts and culture, a rational approach to arts and culture that doesn't throw away emotion. So that's, part of the approach that we're taking with Troubadour. And this Metaphysical Mondays is a way to kind of approach other forms of poetry that will give you a better idea. So if you really follow along, I think it'll really help you, with understanding all of these different movements and what makes a movement. And most importantly, I think this is relevant to us, how that movement affects us today and how reading that movement will improve your life right now as well. So our culture is a certain contained unit in a sense, but it's a unit that has been developed through hundreds of years of literary assessment and development. And challenging, sometimes regression. I think we are in a moment of literary regression. And I think we've been in that moment for a while. And it may seem like that's strange when you live in it, but it very much helps to have the context of, oh, this is what greatness really looks like in literature. And yeah, even the normal literate man of this era, although literacy rates were very low, of course, but the normal literate man of this era could read this very easily. It was just like reading a cookbook. Like, it was not that much more difficult. It was not common and normal for them. And that's important, that we've lost an ability to read a lot of stuff. Like, most of English literature, like we all are so proud in the West of our literacy rates are through the roof. Like, everybody knows how to read. Really? What if you can't read? If you can't read Shakespeare, do you know how to read? Or do you know how to read, decipher some very simple, up to a 5th grade level? Is that reading? I mean, yes, it's better than not being able to read, any words on a page, but is it the same thing? Are you truly literate? And that's part of what we're trying to explore here. Okay, so on this first episode of Metaphysical Monday, I'm taking a short poem, The Flea by John Donne, and we're going to be covering John Donne, several of his poems, several of his most famous and most considered his most metaphysical poems, for a reason that will become clear in just a moment. But I wanted to kind of give a context and a broad overview of metaphysical poetry and what that means and what we think it means. Okay, so first let's start with just a broad dictionary definition. And this episode is not going to have like, this is the definition. I don't even know if that's necessarily legitimately possible. I mean, that's always a question when these are man-made products like this, and there are a variety of people involved in them, each with their own slight taste and style. Can you really have a firm definition in the same way that you can have a definition of the nature of a parrot or something like that, or the cosmos even, right? Like, you can identify germs in the nature of a germ and define what a germ is, or a virus, but you can't, it's much more difficult, maybe impossible, or at least with our level of abilities at this moment, to do this with a whole school of art. I mean, you can broadly say that the school of art has these basic characteristics, which we'll talk about. And the way I'm going to, and I'll have one tactic that I'm going to use that I got from other places in my reading. But let's talk about broadly what we're talking about in metaphysical poetry, and what even metaphysical means in this sense. So first off, dictionary definition just broadly is, it says, it's a term adapted by Samuel Johnson, who was a poet critic in the late 18th century. So it's a term adapted by Samuel Johnson in 1779 as the designation of certain 17th century poets, chief of whom were John Donne and Cowley. I hope I'm pronouncing Cowley. It might be Cooley. And these men were addicted to, quote, witty conceits. So we're going to talk about what a witty conceit is today, particularly, and far-fetched imagery. So those are two things you'll read a lot about when you read metaphysical poetry, is that it's far-fetched. And there is something far-fetched about how John Donne is using the flea as a metaphor for sex and, premarital sex in this poem by John Donne called The Flea. Also, you can think of it in its even more broad definition as poetry that expresses emotion within an intellectual context. Now, this is contrasted if you're listening to Sunday morning poetry with Wordsworth intensely. Wordsworth is not about emotion within an intellectual, abstract, esoteric, academic type of manner. He wants to get in the details. He wants to dig into the lives with concretes, with observations that he has made, just by looking out at the world. And then he elevates it with imagination. So it's something we're talking about with Sunday morning poetry. So this is where this quote comes from, or this is where the dictionary gets this from Samuel Johnson. And it was actually an attack on the metaphysical poets in a sense, or in a kind of an accusation almost. Not a full-on attack, but just a kind of maybe frustration with them and the way that they were establishing themselves. Now, he wrote a book called The Life of Cowley. Cowley, a poet. And Johnson accused Abraham Cowley and, quote, a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets, of writing rather as beholders than partakers of human nature, as beings looking upon good and evil, impassive and at leisure, as Epicurean deities making remarks on the actions of men and the vicissitudes of life. So vicissitudes, hopefully you know, is like the vicissitudes of nature or of the weather, where it's like it's a sunny day one day and it's extreme polar opposites going on, and you can see the vicissitudes of a person's personality, right, where they're lovey-dovey one moment and then they're fucking yelling at you the next moment. Like, whoa, you got some vicissitudes going on. It's not a proper use of that term, but anyway, without interest and without emotions. Without interest and without emotions. So in a sense, there is a kind of there's like an intense emotion going on in a lot of these poems, or something intense going on, but the subject is feels somewhat disconnected from the moment. And there is this thing where it's like, in even the Flea, you feel this where it feels like, well, John Donne is part of this, right? He'll use terms that make it seem like he's talking to an actual person, but there's also a certain way that he uses language. He'll say, this flea is you and I. Like he'll talk about, but it's not, it's almost like in the third person. It's not like I felt this about the flea and the flea did this to you and the flea did this to me. There's a kind of disconnecting of the subject, of him and the woman, in a sense. And it's like he's, kind of ascended above it. He's like on a mountain looking at these two people, like from a corporal perspective almost. I mean, there is that kind of feel in this kind of metaphysical poetry. And a lot of what Wordsworth is rebelling against in the Romantics, I think, is that kind of subject being removed from literature. And he wants to put it deep in it again. He wants to really immerse the subject, the you, the I, the person experiencing it, their psychology, their mind. In a sense, these poems, the metaphysical poems, are removed. The mind, the psychology, the feelings, the character of a person is kind of removed. Okay, so continuing with Samuel Johnson real quick. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and illusions. And you'll see there is some, if you follow along with Metaphysical Mondays, you'll see there is some truth to this, where it seems like, where are you getting that metaphor from? You're like, I like it. They're ransacking nature. There's wherever they can find an integration. Doesn't matter if it makes a lot of sense. That's why we think of far-fetched imagery with them. Okay, so that's one way to define it. That's one broad, that's where it literally came from in the definition. Samuel Johnson accusing these, quote, beholders, or excuse me, class of, or he called them a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets. They were rather beholders than partakers of reality or of life. Now, I'm just going to, before we get into the John Donne poem in a moment, and if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or troubadourmag.com, then you'll notice I'll put up the actual, poem like I do on Sunday morning poetry. So this is done audio. You could just listen on podcasts, anywhere you listen to podcasts, except SoundCloud, I think. And, on Facebook, YouTube, and you could watch it, and you could also watch it on those channels as well. Okay. So the way I'm going to start this definition and how we're understanding this, and this is why we're starting with John Donne. When we think about how to define something like metaphysical poetry, which is part of what I hope to do with Metaphysical Mondays, is at least get a firmer grasp of the nature of this movement. And one way I propose to define any school of art really is to identify its chief creator. So I believe that when you have a school of art, you tend to have a innovator, a person who started it, and whether they were the best proponent isn't always the case, but they, are someone who changed some form, some sensation, some feeling, some style, something that makes this movement, that's essential to this movement. So in this case, we can say metaphysical poetry is a fairly loose group of poems with family resemblances, all of which in one way or another imitate or respond to the work of John Donne. And even Donne himself seems to respond to Donne, since he builds on the erotically powerful voices of the speakers in his early elegies to create his later and more complex voices, dramatizing poems such as The Sun Rising. So that's kind of where we're going to begin with Metaphysical Mondays. And we're going to be doing The Flea, as I've been saying, by John Donne today. So we're going to do The Flea, and then, how long we do this whole series will depend on how interested you guys are in it. But I think it will be helpful to at least have some context of other movements. Okay, so let us do The Flea, or read The Flea. Mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee. And in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. Oh, stay, 3 lives in one flea spare, where we almost, yea, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed, and marriage temple is. Though parents grudge, and you, we're met, and cloistered in these living walls of jet. Though use make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder added be, and sacrilege, 3 sins in killing 3. Cruel and sudden, hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence? Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphst, and sayest that thou find'st not thyself, nor me the weaker now. 'Tis true, then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor, when thou yields to me, will waste, as the flea's death took life from thee. Okay, so that was a shorter one. I wanted to read it just so you can get a feel for it. I highly doubt it made any sense to you, or much sense to you. But let's break it down a little bit. So first off, understand that this poem is actually a pretty simple argument that John Donne is using to get laid. Simple as that. He wants to have sex with this woman. This is a woman that he is, hoping to marry. He lives in a time when it's not acceptable to have premarital sex. There's a certain kind of sin involved with it. John Donne, just for biographical understanding, was a bit of a rake. He definitely liked the sex, and he was not very ashamed of it. So I'm a big fan of John Donne for that purpose. I think that's awesome, especially living in a time when you could go to jail for it. And in fact, he went to jail because he was pursuing this woman and the parents didn't like him. So they threw him in jail and then they fled to London and so on. But yeah, that's a part of this whole story. I think that's interesting to know. So there's an interesting way, when you think about how he starts this poem. Mark but this flea, and mark in this. So you have to, when you're reading a metaphysical poem or any poem, but John Donne here, what he's doing is he's saying you kind of have to get in the moment. So it's not him saying the pain of this flea has touched my skin and left my skin, and oh, look, the flea has touched your skin. And, there's not like this, he's there. There's almost, like I said, it feels like, oh, you're kind of separated. And it's like, oh, mark this flea. And now this is going to stand for his far-fetched imagery, right? Now, he wouldn't call it that. This is just the imagery he's integrating and making a metaphor of the flea. And he's saying, mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which thou deniest me is. So he's setting it up. The whole poem, those two lines, that first, main idea is that what he's going to be talking about is that this flea is going to be an important metaphor. Mark it. Pay attention. Listen to this. Mark this word that Kirk is saying right now. Mark what we're talking about. And you can also say, there's a connotation, or even the denotation, the actual meaning of the word mark, of like marking on a wall or something like that too. So he's kind of marking, he's making a meaning from this. So that's what's important, is he's going to make a meaning from this flea. That's what he's saying right at the beginning. Mark but this flea, and mark in this. What is this? We don't really know yet, right? Mark in this. But we're going to find out that by this, he's going to say, it sucked me first and now sucks thee. So there's something in this that's action, right? So there's an action that this flea took, and that's what he's talking about here. It sucked me first and now sucks thee. Now, he doesn't, it always behooves you, in my experience of reading these, especially these sexual poems, to not make the mistake that they were unaware or somehow more prudish than we are today. I actually believe that most people are more prudish than John Donne, even though John Donne lived in a very prudish era. I think he was a non-prude living in an extremely prudish era, or I wouldn't even say extremely prudish, like a pretty prudish era, but not the most prudish era. So this is pre-Victorian. This, I believe, would be called Georgian. So Victorian era in England is what you consider probably the most prudish in terms of sexuality, where people were sexually nervous about certain things, but they wouldn't express them. But even in those eras, it's still a mistake to think, or to not assume, that everyone is super sexually naive. Like, in other words, that they don't know what a blowjob is, right? And, so there's something here about the sucking that if your mind goes there, it's not wrong, right? And there's not necessarily wrong. There's definitely a sexual metaphor, but I want to make sure that we're clear on the, just there's a mistake that I think a lot of us make, that we think everybody before us in our era were somehow completely sexually naive and had no idea about anything sexual, because we live in this era highly sexualized with porn everywhere, that we know everything and they knew nothing. And that's just not true. And so he's making this very subtle, not that subtle really, but this metaphor about the flea and the kind of sucking that the flea did. And in this flea are two bloods mingled be. Now, he's going into a broader thing. So he's saying this flea has swapped fluids or blood, right? So your blood, my blood are now mingled with this flea, which is, I don't know if, I don't know anything about fleas, if that's how it actually works. It's interesting that it's a flea and not like a mosquito. I guess a flea, I didn't even know that until I read this poem. It sucks your blood. But, I guess it sucked his blood and her blood. So I guess on some level it has to be mingled. One drop of his, one drop of hers are now in this flea or mosquito. Thou, now by the way, thou and thee means you. So you knowest, that this cannot be said a sin. So the fact that our blood has mingled, our fluids have mingled, right? There's been a sucking relationship between the two. It's not a sin. There's no shame to have. Oh, and you haven't lost your maidenhead. That's your hymen, your sexuality, your virginity, right? So nothing bad happened. Look, so this is the far-fetched imagery. It's like, hey, look at this flea. Nothing bad happened. Like the fluid swapped. Nothing bad. Well, what do you know? Nothing bad happened. It's not that big a deal for fluids to swap. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. Now, how much this, some people say that this is just purely about sex and the sex bed. I almost suspect that this is about oral sex. Like he's asking more for oral sex. And he's saying, yet, yes, this enjoys before it woo, and so like, oh, it has this, there's not this whole courtly thing that's going on here. And, yet there's one blood made of two, and this, alas, is more than we would do. So we're not even going as far as all this, although, as going as far as like, losing your virginity in a sense, because we're going to be just messing, quote unquote, what we might consider today just messing around, right? So that's how I think he's taking this. Although I think you could definitely read it as he's actually asking for just sex, like just flat out sex. And it's just not that big a deal. Oh, stay. Now, he did the same thing with Mark. So he's almost getting out of the poem here, where it's like he's up here again, his corporal sense of him, and he's looking down, telling about this scene, and he says, oh, stay. Like, oh, don't do that. Don't do that. And what do you think he means by don't do that? Don't smash the flea. Don't kill it, right? Oh, stay your hand. 3 lives in 1 flea spare. So he's making an argument. It's like a legal argument he's trying to make to her. He sets it up, right? There's the first stanza. There's a legal argument he makes. I'm going to tell you this argument why you should have sex with me. And then the second stanza, he's like, don't kill that. Let me tell you why you shouldn't kill it and what it means to us. 3 lives in 1 flea spare. You're going to spare 3 lives if you do not kill that flea. Where we almost, nay, more than married are. So we're more than married. The flea, by the way, is you. Oh, and it's me. And this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. What a hell of an argument. So he's saying that this flea represents you, it represents me, and it represents the temple of our marriage bed, the institution of marriage. And we're going to be married, right, baby? And so you can't kill that flea because it's this metaphor that I've been building for you and explaining to you that it's not a big deal to have sex in this marriage bed. You've already done it in this flea, in a sense. Though parents grudge, and we are met, and cloistered in these living walls of jet. So even though we're in this kind of cloistered area where our parents, your parents in particular, don't want us to be together, that's, just take in mind this metaphor. Though use make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder added be, and sacrilege 3 sins in killing thee. So he's like, okay, well, you can kill me, but don't kill yourself, and don't kill the marriage bed, baby. And so, killing me is okay. Let not that self-murder added be. Don't do that. Don't add self-murder or suicide. And don't, for sure, be sacrilegious and kill the marriage bed. I mean, that's sacred. You can't do that. Oh, cruel and sudden. So he does this 3 times. So it's not a coincidence. He's saying, mark but this flea. So it's like he's stepping out of the poem and saying, here's this flea, right? Oh, stay. So it's like, here's an action, and then he makes the argument. And he does it again. Cruel and sudden. What was cruel and sudden? She killed it, right? Cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail, right? Purpled it. Why is it purple? Because she crushed it with her. She crushed the flea with her fingernail. So she basically is like, no, forget your stupid thing. But watch what he does, right? He's very clever as a lover. He doesn't give up. Cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence? You killed our marriage bed. You killed yourself and you killed me. But he's not going to give up. So he's not going to like make her feel bad about it and like harp on her for doing this. Like, he's not going to beg her to have sex with him. He's going to make another argument. He's going to try again. This guy won't give up. Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from you, thee? Yet thou triumphst and sayest that thou find'st not thyself, nor me the weaker now. Oh, wait a second. So you killed that flea. And remember, this flea represents us, right? Okay, so you killed the flea that represents us, despite me telling you not to, and that it was sacrilege. Oh, and this sacrilege, it doesn't make you weaker. Oh, that's interesting. It didn't make me weaker. It didn't make you weaker. 'Tis true. Then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor when thou yieldst to me will waste as this flea's death took life from thee. So did you catch that? So 'tis true that you killed it. Then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor when thou yields to me will waste as this, when thou yields to me. So what is she going to yield to him? Right? Have sex with him or oral sex or whatever. So you're not going to lose any honor by doing this. It's going to be as much honor as you lost by killing this sacrificial animal, this flea, this little flea that is all full of honor. So again, he makes this last ditch effort to convince her to have sex with him or mess around, whatever. By saying that, hey, you killed this sacrifice, this important flea, nothing happened to you. Interesting. There's no shame that you felt, right? Did you feel shame? No. You're not sinning, did you? Like, nothing happened to you. Nothing bad happened to you. God didn't strike you down. Your parents didn't whisk you away for killing this flea. So what would be different than having sex? Because the flea represented sex, right? So obviously it's this intense, like I said, far-fetched imagery that he's using. But I think there's something very fun in that and playful, but it also, I think, gives you a sense of what is metaphysical poetry. And we're going to explore this more as we go along, but notice how you have this really, it doesn't come to you naturally, the meaning, in a way that I think the more you read Wordsworth, the more it kind of just can come to you. In this, you have to use a little bit more broad abstractions. You have to kind of be able to, make these connections that aren't exactly clear. He's not making them necessarily for you, even in the style that he uses. And there is that, you're going to see that a lot where there's a kind of intellectual, use to it or intellectual way that he goes about it. So here is an accusation leveled at Donne, and we will end with this. So it says that his poetry, quote, affects the metaphysics, not only in his satires, but in his amorous verses, where nature only should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy when he should engage their hearts. So in other words, he makes these broad, intellectual arguments rather than using poetry to seduce hearts. So this is an accusation against his poetry and metaphysical poetry. But I think there's something fun and enjoyable to this kind of, the image of a flea that has both lovers' blood in it, that represents something important to him. And even, I also like the argument form. You'll see this again in other metaphysical poets where they use a very explicit style of argument in a sonnet form, in a Shakespearean sonnet form, but they're making certain arguments, and it's almost like a legal argument where it's like, okay, here's case one. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, here's my second attempt. Here's the third attempt at a logical argument. And he's doing this, except he's doing this with very far-fetched imagery. All right. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed Metaphysical Monday, number 1, John Donne's The Flea. Stick around for next week, and we'll be doing a Ballad Wednesday again this Wednesday. We're going to have Edgar Allan Poe coming up, and I do have some hopefully special shows coming up that will be also put on the Facebook page. So I hope you share the stuff on the Facebook page, subscribe, get people interested so we can start doing more and more of this. And for those of you who have done that, thank you. Troubadour is growing every week, so I appreciate all the help that everyone's giving. Okay, and I will see you next time.